What I'd like to do is take a moment and give you a little bit of an overview of the book of Hosea, and then we're going to plow into it. I have to tell you, Hosea can be a very heavy book. It's not heavy theologically, it's heavy emotionally. Probably more than any other book of the Bible, this book expresses how God feels about sin. It's not what he thinks about sin, it's how he feels about it. I want you to picture that God's feeling about sin isn't like, oh, I'm sorry you made a mistake. Oh, I'm sorry that kind of went wrong. I want you to feel that his feelings about your sin are very much like someone who comes in on their partner who's with someone else. When they walk in and there's somebody cheating on them. Or a child feels when dad says, I'm leaving your mother. It's the tearing of a home. It's a deep, real, hurtful feeling. God doesn't just take our sin casually. We do. We take our sin casually. Oops, I did it again, sorry. But God takes it like an affront to his holiness. And part of the reason is, and by the way, Hosea in language that we can express is going to be far short of actual feeling. Words don't convey feelings well, do they? I mean, you can say, I love you, but you can't really put into words what all that means and the richness of it. So I want you to look at Hosea as a story that really sort of unfolds in 14 chapters, God's heart. I want you to stop and see it as during the divided kingdom period, during that 206-year period where there's a north and a south, and this is directed in a very real way during a time in which there's one king in the north, Jeroboam II. He's from 792 to 752. And in the south, this is directed by a southerner in Judah during the time of Uzziah, Yotam, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. I know that because it's in 1:1. Those are the four kings that are named in 1:1. What I can tell you is, it is between 792 and 752, so sometime in the 700s BC or 8th century. I want to break this book down for you for a minute, but I'm trying to look for good words to put this on. In a way, this is a book about understanding God's love and how it works in his judgment, understanding how judgment works in bringing us back to him, and understanding the heartbreak that God has over sinfulness and over the cold heart we can get. You know, it's hard for someone to imagine. Imagine you've been married to someone for a long time, and then they decide they're going to quit your marriage, and the next time you see them, they're with someone else holding hands sitting across the room from you. There's this indignance and this anger and this hurt and this lots of overwhelming, almost conflicting emotions. I'm sometimes not sure how I feel about things. Are you? Sometimes I feel like I feel so many things, I don't know what they are. So it's kind of, this book is so packed. Imagine, did you ever have one of those Play-Doh things where you pushed down on it and it shot the Play-Doh out, like, didn't shoot it out, it kind of went like that out the front? Okay, this is like taking lots of emotion and stuffing it and pushing it, and it's trying to be squeezed out into language, but it's more than you can say. All right, there are 4 parts to the book, so I'm going to give you 4 boxes for the book. Now, does anybody see a problem? Because immediately you should have a problem with, wait a minute, you're going to put emotions in boxes. That's probably not going to work, right? So this is an oversimplification, which is what I do, okay? 1 to 3, 4 to 7. I think it's 8 to 10, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 8 to 10. 8 to 10, 11 to 14. These are 4 different views, but there's something that's in common to each of the sections. Each of these boxes is cut into 3 things. You'd think I'd get better at this after this many years, right? I'm really not. All right, you've heard of Sports Illustrated. This is Sin Illustrated. It's not exactly the same. in the first 3 chapters, he's going to take time and he's going to say, I want you to understand my love in judgment. And I'm going to show you that God is faithful. In the second section, he's going to show you that the sin of Israel is intolerable. In other words, you shouldn't be able to feel right about this. I'm looking across the room at the person I used to be married to. They're with somebody else. They shouldn't be allowed to be happy, having violated our life together. And understand that God is not only faithful, he's also holy. And because God is holy, that the sin that they've been involved in is absolutely intolerable. And as a result, their sin will be punished. Why? Because God is just. You can't do wrong, get away with it, and consider it justice. If one person is able to ride down the road at 110 miles an hour while the rest of us have to do 55, that's just basically unjust. The last one is sinners restored. Because all the prophets follow that bad stuff, good stuff, the back end of a prophet generally has something that is positive, and that is because God is loyal. So we're going to see something about God in each one of these. Now, I think I've described this to you before, but in Middle Eastern terms, people don't always tell stories in linear ways. The linear story of George Washington is George Washington was born, these were his parents, this was the date, this was the time. Then he grew up. Then he had his elementary school. Then he went on to become a military man. And then he had these victories, and then he died. Now, I'm contracting. But that's a linear story. The stories in the Middle East are cyclical stories. What's a cyclical story? Let's do it this way. A cycle will be more like a circle, right? A cyclical story will be, I want to tell you about George Washington, and it can be anything inside of his life that matches the circle. So, for instance, the way a Middle Easterner would tell it would be, George Washington was the first president of the United States. He was a continental Congress, and he was a leader in their military. He was born back then, and then he died in Mount Vernon, and they would go all over his timeline and just keep touching his life as they spin the story. All right, this is a prophet who's going to go, and the first thing he's going to do on each of these comes back around. Let me see if I don't know if I'm explaining this very well, but the very beginning will be, this will be chapter 1, and it's all about principles of judgment. So chapter 1 will be, how does God judge a people? What are the general principles of judgment? And then he moves on, and in 2:1 to 3:13, he moves to the second kind of phase of what he's talking about, and that is how love is shown in judgment. If God loves me, why does he judge me? And this will be about love and judgment. And then when we get down to the end, 3:14 down, 2:14. What did I do? Yeah, this is supposed to be a 2. 2:13. 2:14 to 3:5. That's, of course, there's only 5 verses in 3. 2:14 to 3:5 is about restoration. Steps to restore. I've got to give you more detail on the book before this is going to make sense. I can see that. It's not... In the beginning of the book, he comes out with these principles of judgment. And then you get to the 4th chapter, and he comes back to this idea again. He's dealing again with the principles of judgment, and this time he's talking about straight talk. From the Holy One. And this is chapter 4. And really what he's doing is going back to, remember I told you about judgment in chapter 1? I'm swinging back around. I want to tell you about judgment in chapter 4. And by the way, in chapter 8, I'm going to skip over here for a reason. In chapter 8, he begins that the same way with, you're stuck in a sin pattern. Do you see the relationship between this, and this? The first ones, as he begins each of the boxes, it will be, hey, you guys are doing wrong and you don't understand. I have to step in. I've got to lean into this. It's necessary that judgment come. There's no other way I can do this but come straight at you. In the second part, you see love and judgment. You should see the same sort of thing in the second box, and this will be in chapter 5. Wrath explained. In other words, I love you, therefore I'm going to judge you is in chapter 2. I love you and therefore I'm going to judge you. This is how wrath works is in chapter 5. It's the same cycle. I don't know if I'm getting this across very well. But in chapter, I would say probably in chapter 8, second half. Let's say 8, 1, 2, 7. Let's do that. You're stuck in judgment. In 8 through 10, he goes to the second thing again and goes back to that explanation. And this is examples of judgment. He's going to give 4 examples. And each time he's saying, gotta judge you, gotta judge you, gotta judge you. Here's how it works, here's how it works, here's how it works. And then you get down here, restoration. So we should see something along the restoration line in all these others, okay? In 6 and 7, I should take that out. Take out the 4 there, because there's more than that. Let's go down to 6 and 7, in chapters 6 and 7. And there we're really talking about how I feel. This is how I feel, says God. And the 6 and 7 is really going to be very centered to the book. This is what sin looks like to me. I want to give you 4 examples of deceit and what your deceitfulness is. But I'm doing it toward restoration. It's going to be angled into restoration. All right, let's go down to, we've gotten ourselves all the way through 8. Let's do 9 and 10. And since we're on the bottom line, it should be something along the lines of reconciliation. So there's going to be a plea to reconcile. That'll be at the bottom. And then when we get to the last box and God's loyalty is exposed in the restoration of sinners, this is a very interesting passage. In chapter 11, this is the broken heart of an adopted parent. This is going to be God saying, I adopted you and you've broken my heart. And he sort of explains how that works. That's in 11, 1 to 11. I should probably put these verses in there. And then in 11, 12, all the way through 12, 14. I would probably put it something along the lines as, I see you. I'm working a plan. And finally, you would expect it to end with 13, come home. I want you to see the picture here. This is a picture of a prophet that was called to go and marry someone who was an adulteress, was a prostitute. And in a very graphic way, God describes something about how he feels about Israel's sin. The important thing is, Remember I told you that God views his relationship with us like a marriage? In a very real sense, marriage, our marriage, is supposed to be a picture of, in the Hebrew scriptures, it was a picture of God the Father and his marriage to Israel. In the New Testament, it's who and who? Jesus and his bride, the church. But both of them basically come down to this. Marriage in the Bible equals what? What is marriage for in the Bible? An illustration of what? Our relationship with God. Therefore, a false relationship, something that looks like a marriage but isn't, or has the same features as a marriage would have, at least physically, would be, what would be the spiritual idolatry? Prostitution. In other words, idolatry equals prostitution, or prostitution equals idolatry. In the book, you're supposed to see those interchanges. Does it make sense what he's doing? If a marriage is a relationship with God, prostitution is a false relationship. It's not real. It's not an embedded relationship. Okay. Let me just kind of back into this, and I'm going to walk through the book with you chapter by chapter, but I wanted to set the stage for the book if I could. The book of Hosea captures the dangers of religious performance without a real passion for God. Does everybody know what it means to perform for God with no passion for God? Do you all know how to do that? You know how to say the right things, look like you're doing the right things, and your heart is far from God. Okay, this book is all about a national collective of God's people that are saying the right thing but don't have a passion for him. In a way, I want you to see it as national, but in another way, I want you to take it personally. I want you to see that it's very possible for you to spend long stretches of your Christian life with no passion for God at all, but doing the right thing. And sometimes what we call Christianity is more a culture than it is a passion for God. Subculture of, yes, Christians do it this way, Christians speak that way, Christians act this way. It's not necessarily directly derived because you have a passion to walk with God today. It's because you do the right thing, you know. It's the old, I'll eat oatmeal because it's the right thing to do. You may not like it, you just do it. Now, I want you to take a look at chapter 1 for a minute, and I want you to see if you can see from the very beginning of this book the language of adultery and divorce and rejection. Let me mark off for you some principles of God's judgment in chapter 1. So chapter 1 will be principles of God's judgment. These are the general ways in which God works in judgment. Does God judge people? Yes. If so, there are some principles that help us understand his judgment, and we should have some verses to describe the process of God's judgment and explain the purpose and explain the pattern of it. In chapter 1, it says, the word of the Lord came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham or Jotham, Ahaz or Ahaz, Hezekiah, kings of Judah, during the days of Jeroboam, and you should put the second. It's Jeroboam the second, 792 to 752, son of Joash, king of Israel. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go take to yourself a wife of harlotry, to have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord. So he went to Gomer. This is a word that probably is a word from finished. It comes from a word, may come from the word for finished. It's difficult to know. So he went to Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, which is a place, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, name him Jezreel, God sows. God scatters or God sows. It's you sow by scattering seeds, right? For in yet a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for bloodshed of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. It's a northern kingdom message that you're about to get destroyed. Why? Because of the bloodshed, and that may or may not make sense to you at this point, but here's what I want you to know. Jeroboam II was of the dynasty of Jehu. And when you go through the dynasties, you're going to find out that they came to the throne by overthrowing Ahab's son and having him killed. And Ahab's son, Joram, was killed by this household because of the sin and taking the throne in violence, God was going to end the kingdom. Now, let's step back for a second. What would be a principle of God's judgment? The first thing I want you to see is the first 3 verses. Sin hurts God. I mean, this sounds really funny, but it's almost jump, but sin hurts God. In a very, very elemental way, our sin feels like a personal betrayal to God. I want you to hear it when you get to verse 2. In verse 2, it says, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go take yourself a wife of harlotry and have children, for the land commits flagrant harlotry. I feel like they are cheating on me right in front of me. This is how God feels about it. You're committing flagrant harlotry. You're forsaking the Lord. In verse 3, so he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim. God said, I want you to go out and I want you to do something horrible. I want you to take this woman to be your wife and have children with her when she is lay with many another man. And that'll be shocking to people, but I want you to understand that God is expecting me to continue to produce a future for them while she's laying with lots of other gods. How can you possibly expect that out of me? Do you feel like if you were wronged in that way, if someone cheated on you, they would have the right to expect more from you? Do you think that a person who walks out on your relationship and in front of you flagrantly cheats on your relationship, do you think they have the right to call you the next day and ask you for something? God is saying, you call on me and you ask me for stuff and then cheat on me. And I'm looking right at you and you're cheating on me. How can you do that to me? And then he goes on and says in verse 4, specifically, sin matters to God. Sin hurts to God. And sin matters to God in verse 4. Look what he says. And the Lord said to him, name him Jezreel, for in a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel. And I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. It's important that we understand that although this king got to be king by doing this, Jeroboam wasn't going to last on the throne. You know what happens, guys? Sometimes we do something wrong, we get away with it, and therefore we conclude God's not bugged by it. Has anybody ever done that? You do something, it's wrong, but you don't get caught. And because you didn't get caught and God was merciful and allowed you to go on another day, you sort of thought, well, God's okay with it. Then you did it again. He's not okay with it just because you're not caught today. In fact, one of the hardening effects of sin in our life is not only that it breaches us from God, but it also schools us in the idea that we can do things that don't please Him and He won't do anything about it. You know, it's always a mistake to go up and poke at a bee's nest. And sometimes you could poke at a bee's nest and the bees won't all chase you. They really won't. If you poke too close to where the queen is, they'll all come after you. You don't know where the queen is when you poke it. So the point is that you can poke at something, and just because they don't respond doesn't mean they're happy, and it doesn't mean they won't respond. It doesn't mean they can't respond. You can pick on your roommate, and when they get into a certain level of frustration, they just might haul off and belt you. Dun, dun, dun. Okay? There's a principle that sin is hurtful to God, and there's a principle that sin matters to God, and that while we sin, we can become unaware that it matters to Him because He hasn't acted on it, so we think He's okay with it. Look at verse 5. The third principle is this. Judgment is measured. Judgment is measured. The judgment is often measured commensurate with the sin. That is, the greater the sin, the greater the judgment. This is what he says in verse 5. On that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. What does that mean, break the bow? I will break the power of their army, their power to defend themselves. And in the valley of Jezreel, this Jezreel is not the same as the child Jezreel, but it means the same thing. What is the valley of Jezreel? It has another name in the Bible. Anybody know what it is? The valley of Jezreel. It's the largest agricultural valley in the country. It's also called Armageddon. That's right. All right. In principle number 4, you'll find in verse 6, principle number 4, God offers warning. God offers warning. Just remember, grace time, the time between God tells you you're going to be judged and judgment, is grace time. Why does God warn people? When I say to you, you better knock it off up there or I'm coming up with a belt, what am I doing? I'm giving you a chance to change the outcome. Grace is God giving you a chance to change the outcome. So it says God offers a warning. Verse 6, then she conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. And the Lord said to him, name her Lo Ruhamah, and I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel, that I would ever forgive them. Lo Ruhamah is literally the words no compassion. Not have compassion. I won't have compassion. There will be no compassion. So I want you to have another child. This time, name her, you ain't getting out of it. There will be no compassion. You will not get away. You have to understand how the northern kingdom fell. By 750s, they are walking around flagrantly walking against God. By 722, when the Assyrians come in, they will impale them on poles. They will make human popsicles out of them. We know this because the kings of Assyria went back and decorated their dining hall with images of human popsicles from the northern kingdom of Israel. It shows them taking them captive and impaling them on poles. Dracula became known as an impaler. That idea of just sticking people on poles and letting them slowly have a pole go through their body and kill them is pretty much a nasty way to die. Although there's quite a few nasty ways to die, that's got to be up there on the top of the list as slow and terrible ways to die. So this is the Assyrians that God is going to use to take them down. He says, I'm not going to have compassion on you because you have walked right into this. I want you to understand that although sin hurts God and sin matters to God, judgment is measured in accordance with how bad what you were doing is, and God offers warnings. And when He offers warnings, you have a chance to turn the end. Now, the fifth principle is in verse 7 and verses 7 and 8, and that is judgment levels. It levels the field. The uneven field is leveled by God's judgment. I want you to know that there are people getting away with an awful lot. There are people that are doing some heinous things before God, but God will level the field at the judgment day. Judgment levels. Listen to this. I will have compassion on the house of Judah and deliver them by the Lord their God, and will not deliver them by bow, sword, battle, horses, or horsemen. When she had weaned Lo Ruhamah, she conceived and gave birth to a son. You have a story being told through the children. By the way, from time to time I hear people say, boy, that's just wrong. They're naming these kids and they're telling a story through the life of the kids. Listen, the most privileged place you'll ever have in life is for God to use your life to tell His story. No matter what it's like, if He is using your life to tell the story, you are being used by the Creator, and that is the best place you can be. The sixth principle is found in verse 9. Warnings offer deterrence. Look what he says. The Lord said, verse 9, name him Lo Ami. Am is nation or people. Lo is no. Not my people, not my nation. For you are not my people, and I am not your God. That, by the way, is the formula for divorce. When I tell you that God the Father divorced the nation of Israel, that's the formula for divorce. The divorce formula, by the way, it's a temporary divorce. God goes back and in the end is reconciled to Israel. I don't want to forget to mention that point. But the point is that the way you got a divorce in the biblical period is say, I am not your husband, you are not my wife. That's the public breaking of the covenant declaration. So here God is doing it. One last principle before we get a little break here. Judgment is carefully controlled in verses 10 and 11. Judgment is carefully controlled. God does not discipline His people rashly, but with a view toward pulling them toward His love. So He says, yet the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it is said of them, you are not my people, it will be said to them, you are the sons of the living God. Stop right there. Do you see it? God's formula with divorce was hooked together with a verse that says, but we're going to reconcile later. So there's a divorce. I am putting you away. You are not my spouse, but you're going to be numbered like the sands of the sea. You're going to spread out and be great in number, and you will be the sons of the living God. In other words, within the first chapter, I'm going to judge you harshly because of what you have done, but I'm going to turn around and I'm going to eventually take you back. He says in verse 11, the sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together. I want you to stop right there. In verse 11, I want you to see that there's a prophecy that this is the first time we're really encountering this. Do you remember that 206 years there was a north and south? And then in the year 722, the Assyrians took away the northern kingdom. And for 136 years there was a southern kingdom only. And prophets came back and said, when God gathers the Jewish people, they'll be both from the north and the south. That was shocking to them. Why? Because the southern kingdom was around a lot longer, and the northern kingdom, the people were lost. I want you to remember, Jews were scattered for generation upon generation around the world. And yet God promised to gather them back together, not only from Judah, but also from the northern kingdom, from Israel. And from a Jewish perspective, that's impossible. We can't get the northern kingdom back. They've been gone already for 136 years by the time we went into exile in Judah. There's no way God can gather them all together. So I want you to notice that verse 11 is a very important verse. It's the verse, the first time you're reading, God is going to gather all Jewish people, all the Jews back together, even from the northern kingdom and from the southern kingdom. And they will appoint for themselves one leader. What's the one leader there? This is a shock. It's very hard to read because it's too early in your prophetic digging. God says, coming out of the valley of Jezreel, what's its other name? Armageddon. Coming out of Armageddon, there will be one leader, and he will lead one people of the Jewish people, both from the north and the south. What promise is that? It's the promise of Messiah over the Jewish kingdom at the end of the tribulation, at the end of the valley of Armageddon, at the end of a great battle. Do you remember I told you earlier that when we read Revelation, the story unfolds like the nations of the world come down on Israel. They've surrounded Israel. Her back is at the sea. She can't escape. And then Jesus comes through, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, written on his thigh in Revelation 19, and he speaks and he mows them down. And then they look on him whom they have pierced, and they weep because they realize that the piercing was partly their fault. But the Jewish people together come and all of them behold him, fall to their knees, and finally at the end of 7 years, being chased by the world, being beat up by everyone, realizing that there's no one that loves them like he does, they all come to him at one time. Paul says it this way, and so all Israel will be saved. That's on that day, at that time when they see him. Does that make sense? Okay, that's this prophecy. So I would write next to verse 11, Revelation 16 through 19, and we are going to see that story in graphic detail. But the forerunner of the story for that is in Hosea 1:11. Then I would go to Revelation 19, verse 11. I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and wages war. His eyes are a flame of fire, on his head are many diadems. Those are ruler crowns, because he's king above all kings, right? And he has a name written on him which no one knows except himself. He is clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies which are in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that with it he may strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. I would put right next to verse 15, Hosea 1:11. This is the promise that the Jewish people will have one leader, that he will come, that he will rescue them. And that's why in the beginning of chapter 20, Satan is bound, and there are a series of thrones and a kingdom that is called a kingdom of 1,000 years. The millennial kingdom, Revelation 20, verse 1 says that Satan is bound. It says, Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan. In case you don't know who he is, he goes the long way in saying the dragon, serpent of old, Satan, devil, whatever you... He says, he threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed over him, that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years is completed. We get the word millennium, 1,000 years, from this. Okay? During that 1,000 years, there's a kingdom. Hosea 1:11 says that the king is set up, and the king is set up at the end of the tribulation, at the beginning of the kingdom. Do you understand why 1:11 is an important feature? Expect it to be important because it says, I will gather all the Jews from north and south. Even though many Jewish records have been lost over time, God will gather all Jews north and south, that he will put one leader over top of them. This is a messianic promise.